In the sultry, feverish autumn of 1851, the St. Louis Hotel in New Orleans hosted an event that defied every known rule of economic logic and human behavior. A dark and unsettling mystery that historians have quietly discussed for more than a century. In the center of the rotunda, beneath the grand dome where fortunes were exchanged like playing cards, a woman known only as Amara was placed upon the auction block. She was described by the few surviving witnesses not simply as beautiful, but as unearthly, carrying a gaze that silenced the raucous crowd of cotton magnates and sugar barons. Yet the official auction ledger, a heavy leather-bound volume now preserved in a climate-controlled vault, tells a story that science cannot explain. According to its ink-stained pages, this single woman was sold and returned 12 times within the span of 6 short months. Each time her price increased, and each time the buyer bought her back within days, shaken, pale, and unwilling to speak of what had taken place inside their homes. What secret could be so disturbing that the wealthiest families in the South would willingly lose thousands of dollars just to remove this woman from their houses? Why did the official records of St. Landry Parish suddenly go silent regarding her final sale to the state's most powerful senator? The answers rest buried in a broken trail of destroyed diaries, sealed court papers, and a pattern of ruin that struck anyone who dared to claim ownership of her. This is not merely a story of the antebellum South. It is a record of moral haunting, a reckoning that proved some secrets are too dangerous to hide, and some people are too powerful to be owned. Before we open the pages of the Red Ledger and reveal the truth behind the most impossible sale in Louisiana history, if you are fascinated by the mysteries history books refuse to teach, subscribe to Before the Story, enable notifications, and like this video. Tell us in the comments from what part of the world you are joining us tonight to uncover this mystery. The narrative landscape of 1851 Louisiana was a world of sharp contradictions, where the heavy humidity of the bayou clashed with the glittering luxury of the aristocracy. In the heart of New Orleans, the St. Louis Hotel stood as the cathedral of this trade, a place where the scent of expensive cigars blended with the damp, earthy smell of the nearby river. It was here, under the towering dome of the rotunda, that the state's elite gathered to display their wealth in human terms. That the season of 1851 carried an anomaly that would later be erased from polite society's memory. The records from that year, especially the Ledger of Human Property Volume 4, contain entries that sharply depart from standard accounting practices. The handwriting of the auctioneer, Jean-Baptiste Muir, normally neat and flowing, becomes uneven, almost frantic, on the pages devoted to Lot 402. The entry introduces a woman named simply Amara. There is no surname, no plantation of origin, no description of her abilities, only notes about her physical appearance, which Muir recorded with an unusual mix of admiration and discomfort. Subject: possesses a constitution of rare quality, the ledger states, but maintains a silence that disturbs the other stock. Unlike others forced onto the block who showed fear or despair, accounts from that time suggest Amara stood in terrifying stillness. She did not cry. She did not beg. She merely watched the men bidding on her with an expression that one observer described in a letter to his wife as the look of a judge observing a hanging. This stillness was the first indication that something was deeply wrong, a break from the expected order that went unnoticed by men blinded by her perceived value. The atmosphere inside the rotunda during her first sale was electric, charged with a tension even experienced traders could not explain. The bidding war was not driven by need, but by competitive frenzy, a desire to possess what was rumored to be the finest specimen ever brought to market. Looking back through history's lens, the obsession appears almost unhealthy. Men known for financial caution abandoned restraint, pushing the price to astonishing heights that defied market standards of the era. They were not purchasing labor. They were buying prestige. They were buying a trophy they believed would secure their position at the top of Louisiana's strict social hierarchy. None of them imagined they were inviting a Trojan horse into their homes, a force that would unravel their lives from within. The first buyer recorded in the ledger was Henri Duguay, a cotton magnate whose wealth was as immense as it was quickly earned. The transaction is written in dry ink. Sold for $5,200 to H. Duguay. Transfer immediate. Duguay, a man known for bold confidence and lack of superstition, reportedly laughed when a rival warned him about the woman's strange presence. He saw only jealousy in their eyes, not the warning carried in the silence of the room. As he led Amara away from the platform, witnesses later claimed the air in the rotunda suddenly turned cold, a strange chill settling into their bones despite the heavy October heat. At the time, this was dismissed as a draft, yet the same detail appears in 3 separate diary entries from that day. Duguay's carriage ride back to his estate on the edge of the city marked the beginning of the phenomenon. His personal journals, preserved only because they were seized during later bankruptcy proceedings, describe an immediate change in the mood of his household. He writes of a heaviness falling over the rooms, of feeling watched even when alone. He notes that the dogs, usually fierce and loyal, withdrew to distant corners of the property and refused to bark. The servants also moved in hushed, anxious patterns, avoiding the new arrival not from dislike, but from instinctive caution. Amara was assigned quarters near the main house, signaling her status as a valuable acquisition, yet she never occupied them in the normal way. Instead of resting or working, she began a behavior that would define her presence in every home she entered. She would stand completely still in certain rooms, staring at a specific part of a wall, a floorboard, or a piece of furniture. She did not speak. She did not gesture. She simply fixed her gaze with such intensity that those around her felt compelled to look where she looked. At first, Duguay dismissed this as stubbornness or ignorance. He ordered her to move, to work, to acknowledge his authority, but his commands seemed to fade before reaching her. In his diary, the pride of the master slowly fractures, replaced by the confusion of a man realizing his power has no effect on the object he believes he controls. On the 3rd day of her stay, the silence broke. It was not Amara who spoke, but the house itself. Duguay returned to find his wife, a woman of delicate health who rarely interfered in his affairs, standing in the nursery holding a crowbar. She had broken open the wall that Amara had been staring at for 48 hours. Behind the plaster and wooden lath, hidden in a dusty cavity sealed for years, lay a bundle of letters and a small, distinctive locket. These were not random items. They were undeniable proof of Duguay's second family, a mistress and children he had concealed in another parish, funded by the money of the very wife who now held the evidence in trembling hands. The revelation was complete and devastating. The image of the happy and prosperous Duguay marriage shattered instantly, destroyed not by gossip, but by physical proof that had been mysteriously located by a stranger who had never before entered the house. Duguay's anger was explosive, yet powerless against facts. He could not punish Amara, for she had done nothing but look at a wall. She had broken no rule, spoken no rebellious word. She had simply acted as a living compass pointing toward the truth he had buried. The scandal that followed damaged his social position, but his immediate reaction was even more revealing. Henri Duguay returned Amara to the St. Louis Hotel the very next morning. The ledger entry is short, written in a visibly trembling hand. Returned, defect in character, incompatible with domestic peace. He forfeited part of his payment, a loss he accepted willingly just to have her gone. He did not request his money back. He sought removal of her presence. Traders in the rotunda whispered that Duguay had gone mad, that he had thrown away a fortune over nothing. They did not realize he was only the first falling piece in a chain reaction about to sweep through the grand parlors of Louisiana. The return of such a valuable asset should have lowered her market worth, yet the laws of economics seemed to reverse. When Amara was placed back on the block, the bidding grew even more intense. Rumors of Duguay's sudden domestic collapse had spread, yet instead of discouraging buyers, they added to her mystery. The second purchaser was the wealthy sugarcane planter Louis Fontenot, a man proud of his skepticism and logic. Al thinking. He believed Duguay to be weak and foolish, and saw a chance to acquire a legendary beauty at a slight reduction. The ledger records the sale at $5,500, a figure that surprised even extravagant spenders. Fontenot brought his prize to his large estate upriver, confident that his strict management style would correct any flaw in character. The Fontenot estate stood as a fortress of order, built upon the forced labor of 300 enslaved souls and maintained with rigid discipline. Yet within days of Amara's arrival, that carefully controlled world would begin to fracture in ways no ledger could properly record, with ruthless precision. Fonteno's diary, kept in the archives of Tulane University, records his early satisfaction. He describes Amara as docile, writing that she moved with a grace that improved the beauty of his household. Yet the tone of the entries changes sharply within 48 hours. He starts to complain of a foul heaviness in the air, a feeling of choking pressure that seemed to spread from the woman's presence. He writes that she refused to sleep in the quarters given to her, choosing instead to stand in the middle of the carefully trimmed rose garden, staring without blinking at a patch of disturbed soil beneath an ancient oak tree. The staff, alert to the unseen forces of the plantation, gave Amara a wide berth. They whispered that she walked beside old spirits, that she was not completely of this world. Fonteno brushed off these superstitions with the scorn of a man who believed in science, yet he could not ignore the strange behavior inside his own home. His youngest daughter, only 6 years old, began speaking about a crying baby in the garden, the sound she insisted she heard only when she stood near the silent woman. The child's distress, together with Amara's unsettling stillness, slowly wore down Fonteno's patience. He threatened Amara with the whip, demanding that she move away from the tree. She lifted her eyes toward him, and for the first time Fonteno felt the full weight of her presence, a judgment so deep it made his hand shake. The peak of the Fonteno household's ordeal came on a Sunday morning as the family prepared for Mass. Fonteno's wife, driven by a frantic impulse she later could not explain, ordered the gardener to dig up the rose bush Amara had been watching. Fonteno tried to stop it, but the command had already been given, and the gardener, frightened by the mistress's unstable state, pushed his spade into the earth. 3 feet down, wrapped in a rotting linen sack, they uncovered the skeletal remains of an infant. It was not a slave child, as might have been sadly common, but a baby wrapped in a blanket, stitched with the Fonteno crest, the result of a secret affair Fonteno had carried on with a governess years before, a child he had buried himself to protect his reputation. The discovery destroyed the Fonteno dynasty. His wife's screams echoed across the neat lawns, a cry of betrayal that no fortune could quiet. Fonteno stood frozen, the shovel resting at his feet like a silent accusation. Amara stood several yards away, her face calm, her task complete. She had not dug the grave. She had not spoken a word. She had only revealed the darkness where the sin had been hidden. The nature of her power was becoming clearer. She did not create the chaos. She simply removed the shadows that covered it. She was a mirror in which the moral decay of her owners was reflected with painful clarity. Fonteno, broken by the exposure of his worst crime, returned Amara to the rotunda the very next day. The ledger entry marking her return was even more mysterious than the first. Returned. Unsuitable. Bad omen. He accepted a loss of $1,000 on the sal. A desperate price paid to free himself from the living witness of his guilt. The auctioneer, Jean-Baptiste Muir, began to regard Lot 402 with a growing unease. He wiped the page clean, dipped his pen in fresh ink, and prepared to sell her again. But the whispers in the rotunda had shifted from jealousy to fear. Still, greed can numb even the sharpest fear. The third buyer, a judge from Baton Rouge named Etienne Lair, believed he possessed the moral strength to manage whatever curse followed this woman. He was a man of law, a symbol of discipline, convinced that order could be forced upon any disorder. He purchased Amara for $5,800. Certain that the previous owners were simply men with guilty consciences, he brought her into a house that functioned like a temple of rules, where every account was balanced and every regulation obeyed. Yet Judge Lair forgot that law and justice are not always equal, and his home rested upon carefully crafted lies. Amara's stay with the Lairs was the briefest of all. She remained only 2 days. She did not stare at a garden or a wall. She stood inside the judge's private study, her eyes fixed on the heavy iron safe where he stored his most confidential papers. The judge found her there, in the middle of the night, standing motionless in the pale moonlight. He ordered her to leave, but she did not move. Furious, he reached for his pistol. Yet before he could raise it, his own son stepped into the room. The young man, puzzled by the strange woman's focus, asked his father what was inside the safe. The question lingered in the air, thick with sudden dread. The next morning, Driven by a suspicion he could not fully explain, the son stole the key and opened the safe. Inside he found not money, but a forged will, the document that had disinherited his cousins and redirected the family fortune to his father. The judge had stolen his own relative's inheritance with a single signature, and the proof had rested in that iron box for 10 years, silent, until Amara's silent gaze seemed to force it into the light. The confrontation between father and son was fierce and final. The judge was unmasked as a fraud, his image as a man of honor destroyed by one sheet of paper. Amara was returned to the auction block within the hour. The judge did not speak to the auctioneer. He simply abandoned her there and fled the city. The pattern could no longer be denied. 3 families, 3 secrets, 3 collapses. The legend of Amara moved beyond simple gossip in the rotunda and entered the territory of folklore. She was no longer seen as merely a woman. She became a curse, a wandering conscience that could not be owned, only borrowed, at the price of one's soul. And still the line of buyers did not shrink. It grew longer. By November 1851, the Red Ledger began to resemble less a record of sales and more a register of social ruin. The entries quickened, turning into a rush of transactions stretching across Louisiana's aristocracy. A shipping magnate from Algiers purchased her on a Tuesday and returned her on Friday after his wife uncovered receipts revealing a hidden gambling debt that had placed their entire fleet at risk. A plantation owner from Point Coupee kept her for a week, only to see his entire labor force halt work in a silent act of resistance that ended only when Amara was removed from the land. In every instance, the disorder followed her silence and her steady gaze. The gathered evidence from this time is overwhelming. Court documents from 5 parishes show a rise in divorce filings, inheritance disputes, and sudden bankruptcies that match exactly with the dates of Amara's stays. Letters exchanged between the wives of these powerful men, preserved in dusty attics and historical collections, reveal a chilling pattern. They write of the Lady of the Ledger, not with hatred, but with trembling respect. She does not sleep, one wife confided to her sister. She stands in the corridors like a spirit of judgment. My husband cannot meet her eyes, and because of that, I know he is hiding something. The statistical improbability of her constant returns began to draw notice beyond the circle of wealthy buyers. Muir attempted to hide the pattern by listing her under new titles in the catalogue: the Nubian Beauty, the Silent Pearl, the St. Landry Gem. But the buyers recognized her not by a name, but by the quiet force that surrounded her. The price kept rising, fueled by twisted reasoning. If she ruined the man before you, it meant he was weak. If you could withstand her presence without falling apart, you would prove yourself the ultimate patriarch, a man without secrets. This arrogance fed the cycle. A timber baron bought her and lost his empire when hidden illegal contracts were discovered behind a painting she would not stop watching. A deeply religious deacon purchased her and was stripped of his position when private journals filled with doubt and vice were found beneath the floorboards where she stood. The proof was undeniable. Amara acted as a trigger for truth. She was like a living force of transparency, placed into a society built on deception, repression, and carefully hidden crimes. The physical cost to Amara is never recorded in official documents, but private letters from household servants tell another story. They describe her growing thinner, her eyes burning brighter, as if the weight of uncovered secrets was eating her from within. She became a vessel for the trauma of an entire state, absorbing the sins of her masters and casting them back with blinding clarity. The servants treated her with a reverence usually reserved for holy icons, leaving small offerings of food and water that she barely touched. To them, she was not enslaved property. She was an avenging spirit sent to restore balance. The chaos rose to such intensity that the auction house considered forbidding her sale. Muir wrote to the city council, asking for advice about a property that appeared to carry a harmful influence over the city's trade. He suggested she be sold out of state, sent north or perhaps to the Caribbean, anywhere far from New Orleans. But the council, made up of men as proud as they were wealthy, refused. They argued that banning her would mean admitting fear, showing that the white elite were frightened by a single enslaved woman. They insisted she remain on the block as a challenge to their authority. During this feverish period of buying and selling, the nature of the secrets began to change. At first, they were private matters, affairs, theft, deception. But as Amara passed through the highest levels of power, the secrets grew darker. She began exposing crimes of blood, murders disguised as accidents, disappearances explained away as runaways, land stolen and approved by corrupt judges. She was moving closer to the rot at the center of the system, circling inward toward a truth that threatened not only individual men but the very structure of power itself. Individual families, but even the very legitimacy of the state itself. The red ledger contains one last entry before the final sale. A rich widow, a cousin of Madame Laurie, bought Amara hoping to gain a quiet companion. It was the only occasion she was ever sold to a woman. The arrangement survived only 6 hours. The widow sent her back that same afternoon, shouting that Amara had stood beside the fireplace where the widow's late husband had passed away, gazing into the fire without blinking. The widow, who had inherited the entire estate, could not endure the meaning she felt in that stare. She surrendered the full purchase amount, rushing out of the rotunda as if chased by unseen spirits. By December, Amara had been sold 12 times. She had ruined 12 reputations, shattered 4 marriages, and sparked 3 criminal inquiries. She was the most dangerous possession in Louisiana, a human bomb waiting for someone to light the fuse. And still, the final buyer was already traveling toward New Orleans, a man convinced that only he had the strength to silence the past. He did not seek a servant. He intended to bury a memory amid the swirling gossip and growing fear. A man of science tried to explain the strange events. Dr. Julien Fourier, a Creole physician famous for his research on the nervous condition of the enslaved population, asked for permission to study Amara during one of her short stays at the hotel. His private case journal, a leather-bound book filled with careful anatomical drawings and detailed clinical observations, provides the first and only medical account of the woman who was frightening the aristocracy. Portier began his examination with the doubt of a strict positivist, certain that the so-called curse was only mass hysteria, born from superstition and buried guilt. Fourier's notes dated November 14, 1851, describe their first meeting. The subject shows no physical irregularities, he wrote. Heart rate is slow and extremely steady, no evidence of fever, palsy, or madness. Her gaze, though steady, does not reveal emptiness or weakness of mind, but instead an intense awareness that is medically unsettling. He tried to speak with her, to test her reasoning abilities, yet she stayed silent. It was only when he placed his hand lightly upon her shoulder to examine muscle tension that he recorded an unusual bodily response. Upon contact, the subject's skin seemed to grow colder, and I felt a sudden wave of vertigo, along with a brief visual distortio. As though I saw smoke where none existed. Dr. Fourier, disturbed but persistent, developed a theory that was daring for his era. He suggested that Amara was not the cause of the destruction, but merely a passive reflector. In a letter to a colleague in Paris, he wrote, "It is my conviction that this woman holds such extreme nervous sensitivity that she functions as a mirror to the hidden anxieties of those near her. She does not know their secrets. She simply resonates with the physical suppression of their guilt. The men who purchase her do not fear her. They fear the reflection she provides. She is a living instrument that detects the concealed conscience." This mirror theory clarified the precise pattern of the events. Amara did not guide wives to secret letters or hidden graves. She only drifted toward the center of tension within a household. When a man hides a crime, he forms a psychological void, a point of enormous strain. Poirier argued that Amara was instinctively drawn to these voids, standing near the physical proof because that was where the emotional pressure was strongest. She was not a sorceress. She was evidence of a sick society. Fourier's inquiry grew darker when he began interviewing the families who had returned her. He observed a shared medical pattern among the patriarchs: severe insomnia, trembling hands, and a deep refusal to look at their own reflections. The men suffered from what Fourier described as moral collapse. Their bodies weakened rapidly after possessing Amara, as if the effort of defending their lives against her silent presence drained their strength. One former owner, he recorded, had clawed out his own eyes in madness, crying that he could still see her staring at him. The doctor's journal also reveals a troubling detail about Amara's physical condition. Though she was sold again and again, though she survived on the poor food of auction houses, she displayed no fatigue or signs of starvation. It was as if she survived on something beyond bread. Fourier scribbled in the margins, "She feeds upon revelations." With every household that falls, she seems stronger, almost radiant. It is a parasitism of truth. This realization caused Fourier to fear for himself. He suddenly ended his study after only 3 days, claiming that he too had started seeing shapes in the shadows of his clinic, faces of patients he had failed, errors he had hidden. Fourier's final note on the matter was a warning that no one listened to. He advised the auctioneer Muir that Amara was medically incompatible with the institution of slavery. He insisted that a slave must be a blank surface upon which the master writes his will. Amara, however, was a mirror that reflected the master's will back onto him. "You cannot own a reflection," Fourier warned. "If you attempt to seize it, you will slice your hands on the glass." The medical community dismissed his ideas as imagination, yet his theory remains the most persuasive explanation for the strange events of 1851. It implies that the horror was not supernatural, in the common sense, but psychological. Amara was weaponized empathy, a presence that forced the buried trauma of the slaveholding class into the open. She was the unavoidable counterforce to a system that depended entirely on silence. Dr. Fortier's journal was stored away and forgotten, only rediscovered many years later, but in the winter of 1851, his caution was just another faint whisper in a city drowned by commerce. The auction went on, the bids climbed higher, and the mirror waited for the one man whose secrets were dark enough to finally shatter the glass. By December, the influence of Amara's presence had moved from the account books of men into the drawing rooms of women. The social fabric of Louisiana's elite, usually woven tightly with manners and strict protocol, began to tear. A chain of letters exchanged between wives, daughters, and sisters of parish patriarchs shows a clear change in perspective. To the men, Amara was a burden, a curse to be removed. But to the women trapped in marriages built on silence and deceit, she became something different, a dangerous fascination. They started calling her the truth-teller. The letters of Madame Deline, a respected socialite whose husband had nearly purchased Amara, record this division. "The men are frightened," she wrote to a cousin in Natchez. "They speak of her as a witch or a demon. But I have observed the way women watch her when she walks by in the street. It is not terror in their eyes, it is hunger. They wish to know where the money disappears, who the village children resemble, why the study door remains locked. She carries the keys we were never given." This quiet network changed the market itself. Women began gently pressing their husbands to buy Amara, pretending admiration for her appearance or her skills, while secretly hoping she would uncover the secrets hidden in their own homes. It became a high-risk game of domestic strategy. To bring Amara inside was to invite disaster, yet for many women, the truth was worth the loss of wealth. They were ready to burn their golden cages just to see what lay hidden in the ashes. The division also deepened across racial lines. The enslaved women within the households, the cooks, maids, and nurses, formed their own silent channel of information. They knew the secrets long before the white wives, but they held no authority to reveal them. Amara became their symbol. When she stood quietly facing a wall, the servants would make sure the mistress entered the room at precisely the right time. It was a wordless alliance of the oppressed, a planned effort to weaken the master's using his own purchase as the weapon. The social season of 1851 crumbled under this pressure. Balls were called off. Dinner gatherings turned into evenings of tense silence. No one knew who would fall next. The effect of Amara created an atmosphere of suspicion, where every glance felt like an accusation. Husbands began to distrust their wives, and wives started to see their husbands as strangers. The basic trust of the patriarchy, the belief that women would accept necessary lies to preserve comfort, was broken. In churches, sermons began addressing the spirit of discord haunting the parish. Preachers warned against curiosity and the demon of division, urging their congregations to return to the established order. But the pews were filled with people who had glimpsed the truth and simple words could not undo that vision. Amara had revealed that the so-called divine order was often a mask for human corruption. The moral authority of the church, which had long defended slavery, weakened under the exposure of the sins it sheltered. One striking case involved the wife of a wealthy banker who, after Amara revealed her husband's theft of church funds, rose in the middle of Sunday service and walked out, followed by her 3 daughters. It was a public refusal of the social agreement. The banker was ruined within days, yet the image of his wife leaving remained, a symbol of women choosing truth over status. Records from that period show a rise in legal petitions for separation of bed and board, a rare and shocking action in 1851. The women grew bold. Amara's presence had given them proof that hidden truths could be uncovered. Even after she departed from a home, the changed stayed behind. She left a legacy of questioning. The blindfold had been removed and could never be tied again. As Christmas drew near, the tension in New Orleans was heavy. The city was holding its B. Wreath.it's breath held tight, waiting for the final act to unfold. The red ledger lay open on the auctioneer's podium. Lot 402 listed one final time. The community was broken apart. The families were divided, and the stage was prepared for the arrival of a man who believed he was beyond the consequences of his own past. Senator Leonidas Thorne was coming to purchase the truth-teller, and he planned to silence her forever. On December 20th, 1851, the final sale of Amara took place. It was an event recorded not only in the auction ledger, but also in the political columns of the New Orleans Picayune. The buyer was Senator Leonidas Thorne, the Lion of St. Landry, a man whose political power stretched from the bayou to Washington, D.C. Thorne was the perfect example of the Southern power broker. Wealthy, ruthless, and publicly beyond reproach, he bought Amara for the shocking sum of $8,000, a number that quieted the entire room. But Thorne did not purchase her for labor or for status. He bought her to destroy the legend. Thorne's motive is clearly revealed in a letter to his campaign manager written the night before the auction. "This superstition has lasted long enough," he wrote. "The fools of this city are afraid of a slave woman's stare. I will buy her. I will crush her spirit, and I will prove to these cowards that power lives in the will of the master, not in the strange ideas placed on property. By Sunday, she will be scrubbing my floors. By Monday, the legend will be finished." It was an act of extreme pride, a public challenge to the curse that had already taken his peers. Thorne brought Amara to Belter, his massive plantation hidden deep in the swamps of St. Landry Parish. Belter was a kingdom of its own, a place where Thorne's word was law, and the outside world was kept away by miles of dark water and tall cypress trees. The estate was said to have been built on land, gained under questionable circumstances many years earlier, yet no record of the sale existed in the parish archives that Thorne himself controlled. When she arrived at Bel Air, the feeling of the plantation changed immediately. The overseers, harsh men chosen carefully by Thorne, reported a sudden tension among the field hands. The work songs ended. One overseer wrote in the plantation log, "The silence is louder than the singing." Thorne, determined to show his authority, ordered Amara to serve dinner in the main dining room on her first evening. He invited his political allies to witness his victory. The dinner became a disaster of historic scale. Witnesses later said that as Amara poured the wine, she paused behind the chair of the parish sheriff, an important ally of Thorne. She did not pour, she only stood there. The sheriff, a man known for his violent temper, began sweating heavily. He choked on his food, gasping for breath as if an unseen hand was tightening around his throat. He rushed from the table, knocking his chair to the floor. Thorne, furious, ordered Amara to leave, but she turned her eyes toward him. For the first time, the senator felt the cold fire that Dr. Fortier had once described. Clear proof of Thorne's weakness appeared 2 days later. Thorne discovered Amara standing in the ruins of an old sharecropper's cabin at the edge of his land that was supposed to be untouched. She was staring down at the earth. Thorne ordered her dragged away, but the place she had marked could not be ignored. His wife, Elelena Thorne, who had watched the arrival of the so-called witch with deep fear, walked to the site after her husband left. There, half buried in the mud, was a burned wooden post, the remains of a house destroyed by fire. Elenina knew the history her husband had tried to hide. The land of Belter had not always belonged to them. It once belonged to the Cavalier family, a group of free people of color who had farmed the rich soil for a generation before Thorn came. They had vanished overnight in 1825, their land absorbed into the Thorn estate by a sale no one had witnessed. The charred timber was physical evidence of the fire that had consumed them. Thorn's reaction to Amara's presence was not guilt like the other owners. It was the rage of a predator uncovered. He understood that Amara was not just a silent mirror. She was a guide. She was directing the eyes of the living toward the graves of the dead. The exactness of her knowledge, finding the precise location of the Cavalier homestead in 1,000 acres of swamp, was impossible unless she remembered. The effect on Thorn was rapid decline. His journal entries from that week show a fall into paranoia. He started carrying a pistol inside his own home. He dismissed the overseers, believing they were plotting with the woman. He stopped sleeping. The Lion of St. Landry was being hunted in his own den, not by wolves, but by a silent woman who refused to look away. The undeniable proof was no longer just a ledger or a letter. It was the land itself crying out against him. The breakdown of authority at Belter was complete and fast. By the fourth day, the plantation no longer functioned as a working economic unit. The enslaved people, sensing the change in power, began a quiet rebellion. Orders were misheard, tools disappeared, gates were left unlocked. The system of fear that Thorn had carefully built was falling apart because the source of fear had changed. The master was afraid, and his fear spread quickly. The home collapsed first. Elenina Thorn, a woman who had spent 20 years mastering the art of ignoring the truth, crossed her own line. She refused to share a bed with her husband. Instead, she spent her days in the sewing room. Here, Amara was confined. Servants reported hearing Elenina speaking for hours, not questioning, but confessing. She spoke of the nightmares she had suffered, the screams she had heard years earlier, and pretended were only the wind. Amara listened, her silence working like a vacuum that pulled the poison from Elenina's soul. The collapse reached the staff as well. The head housekeeper, a strong woman named Sarah who had served the Thorn family for decades, stopped enforcing the senator's commands. She unlocked the pantry. She allowed extra food for the field hands, and most dangerous of all, she allowed Amara to walk freely through the house at night. Thorn became like a prisoner inside his own library, the only place where he felt secure, drinking heavily and preparing legal papers to have Amara sent to an asylum. But the most serious collapse was inside himself. Thorn's political connections began to weaken. The sheriff, embarrassed by the dinner, refused to return to Belter. The judge who had approved Thorn's land claims sent word that he was ill. The senator's power depended on the image of strength, and Amara had broken that image. Without his allies, Thorn was only a man with stolen land and a guilty mind. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the tension finally snapped. Thorn, drunk and furious, tried to strike Amara with his cane in the hallway. Sarah stepped in front of her, blocking the blow, an act that could have cost her life. But Thorn did not hit her. He froze. Behind Sarah stood his wife, his 2 daughters, and the entire house staff. They formed a wall of silent resistance. It was a clear sign of his total loss of power. The patriarch stood alone against the women of his own house, and they were no longer frightened of him. Thorn retreated to his study and locked the door. The sound of the lock clicking shut marked the end of his rule. He was no longer the master of Belter. He was an intruder inside hostile ground. Authority had shifted to the collective, to the group of women who had found their bravery reflected in Amara's eyes. That night the house was quiet, but it was not resting. The women were moving with purpose. The fall of the old order created space for a new plan, a desperate effort to end the tyranny once and for all. Records show that candles burned in the sewing room until morning. They were not stitching garments. They were sewing together a revolution. In the early hours of Christmas morning, the crucial discovery was made, not by accident, but by guidance. Elenina Thorn, directed by a small gesture from Amara, climbed to the attic of the main house. There, hidden inside the lining of an old military coat, that had belonged to Thorne's father. She found the Cavalier deed. It was the original Spanish land grant given to the Cavalier family in 1790, proof of their legal ownership of the land on which Belter stood. But wrapped within the deed was something even more condemning. A handwritten confession by Thorne's father dated 1825. The old man, perhaps fearing judgment as death approached, had written the truth of how the land was taken. He described how he and his son Leonidas set fire to the Cavalier cabin while the family slept inside. He listed the names of the victims, Pierre Cavalier, his wife Marie, and their 7 children. The note ended with a chilling line. The youngest child, a girl of 5, ran into the swamp. We could not find her. We believe the gators took her. The realization struck Elena like a physical blow. Amara was not a stranger. She was the girl who escaped. She was the survivor of the massacre that built the Thorne dynasty. She had not been purchased by Thorne. She had returned to the place of the crime. Her long journey through the auction block, her islands, her unnatural patience. It had all been a long, winding road back to this house, this coat, this hidden truth. It turned a household conflict into evidence of murder and grand theft. It proved that Senator Thorne was not only a cruel master, but also a killer and a thief. The title to the land was invalid. His fortune was built on blood. Every dollar he owned was stained by the crime. Elenina showed the papers to Sarah and to her daughters. The women stared at the faded pages, then at the closed door of the senator's study, then at Amara. The mystery of her impossible presence was no longer a mystery. It was justice waiting to be completed, solved. She was not some supernatural being or dark spirit. She was a witness with a flawless memory, waiting patiently for the moment when the proof could finally be uncovered. Her strength was the strength of a survivor. The discovery created a frightening dilemma. To reveal the papers would destroy the family name and throw them all into poverty and public disgrace. But to hide them would mean becoming part of the massacre. Eleanor looked at her daughters, then turned her eyes toward Amara. The choice stood clearly before her, the comfort of a lie, or the destruction that comes with truth. Amara did not push her or demand anything. She simply stood near the window, watching the sun rise slowly over the swamp that had sheltered her for 25 long years. Eleanor finally decided. She gathered the documents and slipped them into a waterproof oilskin pouch. She was finished protecting the name of Thorne. The source had been uncovered, and now it had to be used as a weapon. While Eleanor planned quietly in the attic, Senator Thorne was preparing his own scheme in the study below. His private diary, the final entry dated December 25, 1851, shows the cold reasoning of a man trapped in his own corner. "The situation is impossible," he wrote, in sharp, slanted handwriting. "The woman knows. I can see it in her eyes. She is the Cavalier whelp. I should have tracked her down in the swamp myself 20 years ago. She has turned my own household against me. There is no selling her now. She is far too dangerous to remain alive. She is a disease." Thorne described his plan with chilling calmness. He would arrange a hunting accident. He would lead Amara into the swamp under the excuse of punishing her for some minor offense. There, deep among the cypress trees, he would remove the threat. "A bullet is final silence," he wrote. "I will tell Eleanor she tried to escape, that she attacked me. The sheriff will support my claim. The law belongs to me." In Thorne's mind, the reasoning was complete. He believed himself to be the protector of his civilization. In his twisted sense of morality, the survival of his bloodline justified any crime. Amara was not a person to him. She was a threat to existence itself, an error in the ledger that needed to be erased. The entry ends with cold determination. "At dawn, I will correct the mistake." But Thorne had misjudged the quiet intelligence network inside his own home. Sarah, who had been standing silently near the door, heard the sound of the gun being loaded. She quickly passed the information to Eleanor. Time had collapsed. They could not wait for courts or for slow justice to move forward. If Amara remained in the house at sunrise, she would be killed. The choice for fast action came at once. The women created a plan that depended on the very invisibility they had been forced to live with. They would not confront Thorne with physical force. They would take him down socially and legally before he could ever pull the trigger. They would act on the night of the 7 letters. Eleanor wrote 7 identical letters and attached copies of the confession and the deed to each one. She addressed them to the governor, the bishop, the editor of the New Orleans Picayune, the federal marshal in New Orleans, and 3 of Thorne's strongest political enemies. The plan required 7 riders to leave the plantation at the same time, each riding in a different direction. Thorne might stop 1 rider, maybe even 2, but he could never stop all 7. The tension that night was almost unbearable. The house felt like a powder keg ready to explode. Thorne sat alone in his study, drinking to gather courage for the murder he planned. Upstairs, the women carefully prepared each package. Outside, the stable hands, warned by Sarah, quietly saddled the fastest horses. It became a conspiracy of justice, a united effort of white and black women, servants and mistresses working side by side, to protect the one woman who had saved their souls. The most touching record of the entire story is not a diary or a deed, but the testimony of the stable boy, young Marcus, given to a federal investigation years later. He described what happened at 3 in the morning on December 26th. The moon stood high, he said. Mistress Eleanor came down to the stables herself. She did not look like a wealthy lady that night. She looked like a soldier preparing for battle. She handed us the oilskin packets and told us, "Ride as if the devil is chasing you," because he is. As the riders thundered through the gates, the noise woke Thorne. He rushed to the window with a pistol in his hand and saw 7 shadows spreading into the darkness. He fired a shot into the night, a useless act against the certainty of his downfall. He understood immediately what had happened. The information was free. The silence was broken. Thorne ran toward the sewing room to kill Amara at once, no longer pretending there would be an accident. He kicked the door open, shouting her name. The room was empty. The window stood open, and the curtains moved in the cold wind. On the floor rested a single object, the iron shackles he had purchased for her, unlocked and placed carefully in a perfect circle. There were no footprints on the rug, no signs of struggle. Amara had disappeared. Historians have long argued about that moment. Skeptics say she escaped through the window and fled into the swamp she knew so well. Others believe she faded into the mist after completing her purpose. Yet the meaning was clear. The chains were empty because they were never strong enough to hold her. She had always been the one in control. Thorne spent the final dark hours pacing the empty room. By noon, he knew the riders would reach their destinations. Telegraph wires would carry news of his crimes. Federal marshals would soon arrive. The image of the Lion of St. Landry would fall away, leaving only an arsonist and a murderer. At dawn, the very hour he had chosen for Amara's death, a single gunshot echoed from the study. The servants did not run to see. They understood that Thorne had delivered his last judgment upon himself. The consequences of the night of the 7 letters were enormous. The New Orleans Picayune placed the story on its front page. Senator exposed in Belterre scandal. The release of the confession and the deeds led to the immediate seizure of the Thorne estate. The scandal dragged down many officials who had ignored the truth, starting a purge of the state political system that lasted for years. Eleanor Thorne and her daughters were left without wealth, but finally free. They moved into a modest home in the French Quarter. Eleanor never mentioned her husband again, yet she kept the oilskin pouch on her mantle as a reminder of the night she chose truth. The Cavalier land was later auctioned by the state, and the money was used to establish an orphanage, a bitter irony that might have amused the late senator. The Red Ledger became a cursed object. Jean-Baptiste Muir burned it in 1852, claiming it carried misfortune, though a clerk had already copied it, preserving the record of those impossible sales. The families who once owned Amara, the Duguay, the Fontinos, the Leilas, never regained their former status. For generations they carried the shadow of the Amara curse, their names linked with hidden shame. Yet the most lasting result was the legend of Amara herself. She was never seen again in Louisiana. No bounty hunter ever found her trail. No grave carries her name. She became a ghost story whispered to children, a warning that truth has eyes and can pass through walls. In the slave quarters, she became a hero, a powerful figure who could bring down masters without raising a hand. Songs were sung about the silent lady who shattered chains with her gaze. Her legacy was not violence, but revelation. She showed that the foundations of Southern power were built on sand, on lies and theft and murder that could not survive the light. She became the first crack in the wall that would later burst open in the Civil War. Many decades later, in 1920, a young historian studying the antebellum South in Paris found a photograph inside a dusty antique shop. It was a daguerreotype dated 1895, taken at a salon in Paris. The woman in the image wore the crest of the Cavalier family on a brooch. She looked exactly as Amara had been described in 1851, unchanged by time, dignified, her eyes fixed on the camera with a powerful intensity. The historian purchased the photograph with shaking hands. If the date was true, he woman would have been nearly 80 years old, yet she appeared no older than 25. Was it Amara, a descendant, or only a strange coincidence that desperate minds hold on to? The photograph now hangs in a private collection without a name. Those who know the story of the Red Ledger cannot look at it for long. They claim that if you stare into her eyes in the picture, memories you tried to bury begin to rise. You feel a cold draft across your skin. You start thinking about the secrets hidden inside your own walls. Amara vanished from official records, yet she never completely disappeared. She lives in the silence that follows a lie. She lives in the fear of powerful men when they hear a floorboard creak at night. The impossible secret was never that she was sold 12 times. The real secret was that she was never truly for sale. She was the debt that had to be paid, and somewhere perhaps the ledger remains open. History is full of empty shackles and burned diaries, small pieces of truth that survive even when people try to erase them. If you believe that justice moves beyond time and that the past is never fully gone, join our community. Subscribe to Before the Story. Press the like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. The archives are deep, and we have only just started digging. See you in the next investigation.